So let's now talk about a pretty common problem with Bullet, and that is that pieces keep moving after they should rest, or they jitter, however you want to call it. They jump around and they never come to rest. So if you look at this at first glance, let's turn it a bit darker so you can see it better. At first glance it looks fine, especially from far away, but when you look closer at the pieces, then you can see there's a lot of movement going on long after the simulation should, have finished. And maybe you had this problem with your own simulation, so let's talk about this. The first thing is there's a very common reason why this happens, and that is actually the underlying collision representation. Because as we know, those pieces that we see here are not actually the ones that are used for the simulation. When we look through the solver under visualize, we can visualize the geometry representation, and then we can see that the pieces are actually not the way they came in. The blue ones, and as usual, unfortunately, I can't turn off the actual geometry, but the blue ones are the actual representation of the pieces for the simulation. And sometimes the problem is that, as you can see, they're not the same, they don't have the same shape, and they tend to be a bit more roundish than the actual pieces, and this is why they keep rolling around. So the way to fix this is actually to adjust this, and you can do this in two places actually, depending what you want. You can do it for the active object, and you can do it for the passive object or static objects or collision objects. And you might change it here, the collision padding, this is what it's about. But in this case, all our pieces are actually active, so be careful. This will not change anything. You need to change it in the active object, so the bullet object has a collision padding as well. So if we lower this maybe to a quarter of what we had before and we rewind, you can see the difference. Now the blue parts are much closer to the actual shape. You can see it here maybe. Let's go back to what it was by default. There you go. You can see quite a difference. And if we lower this to a quarter, the result will be much more stable. It's just, something that you have to test for your particular case. Sometimes if your collision padding is too small, your simulations will not work the way you want. So you have to find kind of the sweet spot. Generally speaking though, be careful with the defaults. This is a, kind of standard size for an RBD simulation, something about 2 meters wide. This is perfect for Bullet, and yet the collision padding is, in my opinion, a little bit too high, a bit too aggressive. So again, in this case, I would go down to a quarter of the default. And this is something you should check because this problem is so common. And if we look at a simulation that has this changed and we look at the results of that simulation, we can see that when we wait a little bit, the whole thing becomes much more stable and we have way fewer pieces that keep, flying around. So if we compare the two versions, one with the default collision padding and one with the adjusted collision padding, you can see that on the left side, the default, there's a lot of movement going on after the simulation should have settled. And on the right side, it's much more stable. Even some pieces are moving over. So yeah, definitely something you should try to check if your collision padding is maybe too high. This is the most common source for RBD movement or jittering after the simulation should have settled. Another common reason why your sim might jitter at the end is that your bounce is too high. So under ground and under bullet object, you remember you have a bounce function to, make your geometry more bouncy or not. And this can also help because stuff, like bricks or wood or so on are not actually that bouncy. It depends on the case, of course. So if you have something bouncy, sure, keep it higher. But if you have something that you don't want to have much movement coming from, then lowering the bounce can help. It's still not a perfect solution, but this is the next thing you should check. How high are your bounce settings? Another thing that can help, but what I would not recommend necessarily, is the built-in sleeping function. We already talked about this. In every bullet solver, there is a sleeping function that you can control via the linear threshold and the angular threshold. And you can visualize this, as we know, under visualize, and then here show active and show sleeping. Now, this is not a great solution though, because it's very unlikely that you will find the pieces that actually annoy you and they will go to sleep. And if you go too aggressive with your threshold, and here you can see it, even though a lot of pieces already went to sleep, the small pieces here that are still moving around are still above the threshold. So if you would lower the threshold, then more pieces would stop more abruptly. and then it will look very unrealistic. So it's not a good solution to use the steeping function to get rid of the RBD jitter. Another option that might work are the rotation stiffness and drag. So let's start with rotation stiffness. We quickly looked at this when we talked about the physical properties, where we can set the density and the bounce and the friction. We can also change the rotational stiffness. By default, this is set to 1. And it really just describes how willing the pieces are to rotate. And personally, I think the default of 1 is not too bad. You should most of the time leave it. But theoretically, what you could try is lowering that number to get rid of too much rotation, basically. So let's lower this rotational stiffness to 0.3. And as we talked about, what is a bit weird here, even though you would think that the stiffness has to go higher so that they move less, you actually have to go down with a number to make them rotate less. So let's have a look at the defaults again. And remember, when you change something, to press reset simulation. And when you do that, you can see that we still have the problem by default, a lot of moving pieces, and they never come to rest. Now let's see what happens if we lower the rotational stiffness to 0.3. Let's reset the simulation and run it again. And while it's better, it's actually still not completely gone. We still have pieces that keep moving around. So maybe we can go more aggressive and try something like 0.1. But when you look at the simulation now, you can see it feels pretty stiff, almost as if there's something that stops them from moving. And it even creates new movement because there is some kind of, weird energy conversion happening here. So it's actually not a great solution, especially when you go down to a really low number. Worst case would be 0. Let's reset the simulation. And if we run this again, we can see that the objects are not rotating at all. So it becomes really unnatural if you go too low, and it can even create new problems. Overall, I would not recommend it. A similar thing is the drag. So instead of stopping the objects from rotating, it's a counter acceleration for the translation or the movement and the rotation. So you find that under forces, and here you can activate drag and drag spin, which simply means that the objects are constantly stopped in their rotation and their movement. This can be a solution, but again, the problem can be here that it changes the behavior of your whole simulation. So if you're not careful, then your whole simulation can feel weirdly stiff and unbelievable, because everything tends to kind of stop very quickly, as if it's, landing on very thin sand or something like that. So maybe you can see what I mean. It loses a lot of the dynamic behavior that it had before. So in my opinion, the best solution is a little bit more complicated, unfortunately, but works the best in my experience. And that is, we build our own slowdown system. And we do this with VEX. And the idea is that we just look for pieces that don't move that much and then very quickly fade their movement away. We can do this in the dive target, and here we can use a wrangle node. And since, as we know, our bullet pieces are all represented as points, we can use a pop wrangle. Oh, and by the way, if you have a newer version of Houdini, probably Houdini 19, then you will find in the dive target a pre-solve and a post-solve. It doesn't matter where you add your pop wrangle to, both will work. So it doesn't matter what you connect the pop wrangle with. And before we do anything, let's calculate the speed. And as we know, that's relatively straightforward. We just calculate the length or the magnitude of our velocity vector. And then we can now use this and create some kind of threshold. So you can do the same with W. I usually do it with V, but feel free to adjust this a little bit. I say if the speed of my object is below a certain threshold, then I will constantly lower, in my case, the rotation, because that's what really bothers me. And a simple way of doing this is simply multiplying this with something that is less than 100%. So for every frame, my W will use 2% of its, strength, so to say. So as soon as my object falls under a certain speed, I will constantly lower its rotation over time. Now the question is, what is a good threshold now for our speed to slow our pieces down? And what I would do here is, let's make sure that it's not actually happening yet by just commenting out the multiplier, and then just run our sim and look at points that you feel are slow enough so that they should slow down. So I don't know, maybe this guy up there, and I can just select that guy. And when I select it, I'm jumping out of my simulation, and what I notice is there is no speed attribute, which is weird because I just created it. There it is. The reason is that by default, the attributes that I create inside are not coming out of my RBD bullet solver, which is a bit annoying. You can change this under advanced output and you add the attribute here, or you simply look from the inside, make sure you figure out what point you currently have selected, which is point 736. And then inside, you just look for this particular point or object in your geometry, 736. And then here inside, you have your speed attribute, and there it is, 016. So something around this speed is good. So let's double check. Yeah, I think we could start a bit earlier, you know, because remember, this is the first moment this slowdown will start. So I think 0.3, something like that will be fine. So let's do this. We uncomment our code and create our attribute, and here threshold should be 0.3, and let's see what's happening. And I think it shows the idea pretty well. In the beginning, everything feels quite natural as before, and only then when the speed of the object is lowering down at the end, then the W or the angular speed will be lowered, you know, aggressively by us manually, and this way the pieces come to a rest very quickly. So yeah, as you've seen, the jitter problem or the never coming to rest problem is pretty common for bullet simulation. The first thing you should check is always, is your collision padding maybe a little bit too high? Because very often the defaults are too high. Also, you should check your bounce settings, because very often they are too high with 0.25. So set them to 0, and then there should also be less movement that you might not want. Nonetheless, even if you do those two things, you will still probably end up with a little bit of movement that you don't want. And there are a couple of techniques to fix that. The built-in sleeping function isn't great. Also, the rotation stiffness and drag, while you can try them, in my opinion, are not a perfect solution, because both change the behavior of your simulation and are tricky to get right. The best approach, in my opinion, is to build your own kind of stopping code, where we calculate the speed of each piece, and then if an object gets slower than a certain threshold with a speed, then we just constantly lower the W or the angular speed so they come to rest rather quickly, pretty quickly. And this allows us also to have much more control which pieces should slow down and how much they should slow down. So I hope this is helpful to solve your jitter problems. Thanks very much, and see you later. Cheers.